Welcome to The Most Important Thing, the show where we break down one key analytical metric for fantasy football in under 20 minutes. I'm Jay, and today we're diving into reception yards per team pass attempt with our guest Peter Howard from DLF. We're going to talk about what it is, where it came from, how to calculate it, how to use it, and why it matters. Let's go. Welcome, everybody. This is the first of the kind show here, so I'm very honored to have the first guest be Peter Howard. You know him as PA Howdy on X, on Blue Sky, on Discord, on Patreon, on YouTube. I know him as a young guy sort of learning how to use numbers in fantasy football. I was the guy that was geeking out to Peter's YouTube videos 6-7 years ago on College Dominator, Breakout Age, but just an all-around great guy, great Patreon, great database. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine, Jay. Thanks. I've been told I got to keep this short, which is not my strong suit, but I'm just gonna like 7 or 8 things there. I'm like, 1, no one knows me. 2, honored, really. 3, yeah, just a lot of stuff wrong with that opening, but you're doing good. You do it. Keep it going, Jay. You're learning. And 7 years. God damn, it's been a long time. I should probably find, an adult hobby at some point.
No, we love it, fantasy football. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig into one analytical metric here, and we're going to talk about reception yards per team pass attempt, or RYPTPA, or you can also use RYPTPA as well. So the formula here for reception yards per team pass attempt is receivers' total receiving yards divided by the team's total pass yards. Yeah, obviously we're talking about a receiver, so we're talking about pass catchers. These are wide receivers or tight ends here that we're talking about. So Peter, how do you characterize reception yards per team pass attempt? Where did it come from? How did it evolve in the analytics community? Why do we use it, kind of thing?
Yeah, just throw all that at me. Sure, I
Yeah,
just do
all at
of
once.
it,
Yeah.
just all at once. All right. Start from the beginning. Why do I like it? I like it because on the one end of the spectrum, it's the ultimate nerdy reason why people don't like statistics. RYP. What are you even doing with all the acronyms? Right? I get it. But the same stat on the other side of it is actually a counter to most of the jargon and nonsense we get thrown at us with statistics these days, because it's a very simple stat if you just think about it. It's what level of the team's overall production was this player, wide receiver, actually producing, like how many yards based on how often they were passing. Because if you've got a team passing 2,000 times a season and they get 1,000 yards, that's bad. But if you're getting 500 yards on a team that barely passes, that actually means you're a fairly significant portion of that team's receiving. And that matters as well, because ultimately what we're chasing in fantasy football, as far as we can tell with statistics, is volume. Good players get the ball. Good players do stuff with the ball, sure. But what you're able to do is countered by other good players on the other team, and then you get a competition level difference. But if you're getting the ball and account for a larger percentage or a larger factor of a team's overall offense, you are the guy. You are the volume guy, and that probably says a lot more about how good you are relatively, at least on that team, than everyone else, or at least what they're trying to do. And you can already start to see the problems with most statistics there, because there are too many caveats and samples too small. That's what I like it. It's a really simple statistic with a terrible acronym, because I don't think anyone actually bothered to think of one. And that's fine. It doesn't need one. You're just dividing their yards by the amount they're passing the ball, or passing and throwing. If you want to just do yards per attempt, that will work as well. You don't need to be behind a paywall. You don't need to have a PhD in statistics to understand it. You're just dividing one number by the other number and not pretending it elicits some magical understanding of how good a player is. You're just looking for how involved this player was in the receiving aspect of the team's game, and it tells you that exactly. It doesn't tell you what that means, or if they're going to be Calvin Johnson, or if they're going to be Calvin Scott. It just tells you that thing. And so despite the acronym, it's actually a very simple statistic that anyone can calculate by very easy to find numbers. And it tells you exactly what it is. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. It's not a secret source because they don't exist. And so that's what I like about it. Anyone can do it. It's very easy to understand. And it tells you something specific. How much that means, you have to actually break into the play a little bit more in itself. But I think that's where statistics should be. You shouldn't expect a number to tell you everything you need to know. It should tell you something very useful, and you should move on from there. And what was the player's situation? What conference were they in? Who were they playing with? How old were they? And so on and so forth. A good statistic should encourage you to ask those questions, not try to overwrite them by, 3, therefore good. You know what I mean? So that's why I like the statistic. It's actually very simple. You don't need any fancy numbers or paywalls to get it. And it's a good place to start understanding where a player was at that point for that team in that situation. That's why.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be.
I have another question there, Jay. So let me just throw this out. The first time I remember hearing about it was late round QB. JJ Zachariason. He mentioned it, and I was like, that's interesting and a really easy thing to calculate. And I have this data. And so I just divided one number by the other number. It's really that simple, and found it to be just what I said, a useful statistic that didn't tell you any more than it suggested it was, but it was a good single point to start understanding a player. And that's the history I know of it. He's the first person I ever know to mention it. And then I just ran it through the same filters we run everything through. Conference adjusting, which never works. It's not going to be a thing. Age adjusting, just to see kind of what I could get more out of it. And there's a little more juice for the squeeze there. But yeah, you don't need to go that complicated with it. But that's the history I know of it. I heard him mention it on the podcast because I, like everyone else, as is no surprise to anyone, just a fantasy football podcast nerd. And I heard him mention it. And like I say, the great thing about it is anyone can calculate it with 2 numbers. And so that's my origin story.
It wouldn't be a metric in fantasy football for the data guys if it didn't have a ridiculously long, confusing acronym to explain it.
And then we're going to debate if it's a metric or statistic. Yeah, just ignore them. I mean, you're just trying to find out a very simple thing, and it does that for you. So that's cool.
Yes. So let's talk about just sort of how to calculate. Do a little example here. This is a receiver has 1,200 yards for the season, with great season, right? But what we're trying to get at is the market share. So we're going to take the team's total pass attempts, which is 400 pass attempts for the team. And the formula is just 1,200 divided by 400. So 1,200 receiving yards divided by 400 attempts. Now, these QB attempts, this is not just the starting QB. This is the whole team's QB attempts. So you don't just grab that starter's attempts. You go and look at the whole attempts. Maybe there were backups that plays. Maybe even wide receivers threw pass attempts. But the whole team's pass attempts go into that 400 number. We calculate this out. It gets to be a 3. 3, by the way, is an elite reception yards per team pass attempt number in terms of market share. So that's a cool number. But anything to note here on the how to calculate it? The one thing that I always note is sometimes we games adjust. So if you want to talk about that or anything else, if a player gets injured, we take sort of the percentage of the season that they were in there as well. So.
I got it, but I think that kind of cuts to the core of it. Again, trying to keep it simple, breezy. 20-minute episode, Pete. Shut the hell up. Yeah. And there is no magic threshold. There are thresholds that you should pay attention to, but it's not like you get over 3 and suddenly you're phenomenal. For example, I went to my college database, which is a thing I've been putting out publicly for free because it's the one thing I know I can actually add. I don't think I'm going to solve the NFL or rookie evaluation, but all these different numbers in one place for free is hard to find, even if it's just team yards and receiver yards by year. And so I've been putting that out for a while, and I just filtered real quickly for a career, and that's the other aspect of this, a career receiving yards per team pass attempt, who is over 3. And since 2001, and since those numbers have always been counted and never paywall, that is everyone that's even remotely been thought to declare for the NFL as a receiver since 2001. I have 16 examples. So yeah, pretty elite. But then you look at the list, and what you've got is Corey Davis, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Boyd, Amari Cooper, and Demaryius Thomas. Like, that's the only elite receivers or good receivers for fantasy football that show up over 3 for their career receiving yards per team pass attempt. And just to go down to two different avenues on one side, yes, you don't have to look at their career numbers because some players play a single year or get hurt, for example. So you can break it down for their individual years. You could do a per game, as Jay mentioned. I think, especially for college statistics, if you're going to per game something, you have to make sure the players have played at least 8 games. And that's pretty much for most positions. And in college, that's pretty much a full season. So does it get you a little extra juice in that squeeze? Yes, but not for the players you want it to. If they have bad numbers in receiving yards per team pass attempt, they're going to have no numbers after you accurately apply a per game filter, because it should eradicate them if they're not playing at least 8 games. And that's probably why they have bad numbers. So it's not going to do and it shouldn't do what some people try to use it for, just throwing that out there. But also, you notice most of the best prospects are not on that list of over 3 for their career, which tends to be the first number I'll look at for this particular category. What did they do in their entire time in college seems to be the best overall first question, right? And the one really elite guy on that list, Amari Cooper counts, but I think Demaryius Thomas is in a slightly, maybe a slightly different class, historically at least. And he played at a conference and a team that was throwing the ball so much against competition that was so bad that his numbers are actually an anomaly, even on graphs that account for Demaryius Thomas type level of production. So 3 receiving yards per team pass attempts is phenomenal, but 1, it's not a threshold. Over that, you're good. And 2, very few are going to make it. And of the ones that make it, most are going to be bad. And most of the good ones doing that are going to be in a very particular situation that really explains it, if you know what I mean. I hate to be long-winded and kind of poke at statistics, but as just a nerd who is not a mathematician or a statistician, most of the time I spent doing fantasy football is understanding what the hell these things were, numbers and statistics, and they sound complicated, and they're really not most of the time. But you just got to get out the habit of thinking you're looking for a number that tells you an answer. Or a threshold where a player is good or bad. None of them do that. And so if you get that right at the start and understand that 3 is good, but it doesn't mean that player good, then you're on firm foundation. Just going to throw that out there. But yeah, that's how you calculate it. You can go per game, but like I say, at a college level, there's really not enough games for it to affect any results that it should affect. So you can also just do the outright numbers.
And the per game, just to be clear, would be, so say a wide receiver plays only 8 games. You take the 1,200 divided by 8, and the team played 13 games. You take the 400 divided by the 13, and that's how you get that games adjusted type basis. So,
because that sounded like sorry, Jay. I know. Laquan Treadwell is the name that comes to mind here. He had good numbers in his last year. And terrible numbers every other year. And I didn't like his profile so much. And when people asked, the simple answer was, if you looked at where his numbers came from when he had good statistics, it was literally 3 games in kind of an out year. And they were very wild exception games. Like that's where his receiving yards per team numbers come up to just below average. Like that's the year everyone was focused on. And that's why I didn't like it. I didn't think he absolutely couldn't. But that's the kind of player that gets helped when you per game it without removing everyone who doesn't play 8 games or less. And it just does more bad things for you than it does good things. So if you're going to per game it, remove everyone that doesn't play enough games. That's all I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. So at least that 8 game threshold kind of for the
8's the one I use. I believe Matt Spencer, who still is a very smart actual numbers and coding guy, but I don't know how much fantasy football. He did a study on it once, and he found the threshold where a stat becomes somewhat useful for fantasy is around 8 games. And I'm pretty sure he ran that through college, but I know he did it for the NFL, so I just kind of adopted it. But if anyone wanted to check that and like find out, actually you can do it with 6, and therefore you get a little bit like, I don't know. I'm not saying for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so how to use it? You've kind of hit on a bunch of this stuff. So age adjusted thresholds versus absolute thresholds. So when we're talking about absolute thresholds, we're talking about is there a particular number you're looking for, a particular threshold that you're getting to? Is it the career average? Is it the best year? Is it the final year? How do you think about that? And then kind of explain what does age adjusted mean to you when you're using reception yards per team pass attempt?
What a smart way of asking that question. What does it mean to me? Again, not smart and not a mathematician or anything else. And so when I came across this concept, because it makes sense, you need something to compare it to. What does 3 mean? I mean, 3 or 2.1 or 1.9. What's really the difference?
Right.
So what you do is you create an expectation. What do good players do at this point in their career or in this situation? And then how well did they do compared to that, the player you're looking at? And so when you're doing it by age, you just find out everyone's date of birth and you calculate how old they are. Don't worry, it's all done for you. And then you find out what's the average, in this case, receiving yards per team pass attempt, that a player who went on to be good at the NFL level for fantasy specifically do at age 18. And there's actually not that many that played. And so you're looking at a fairly shaky average. But age 19, there are a lot more examples. At age 20 and 21, there are a few more. And then it tapers off again in terms of sample size because not many players play in college after that point that go on to do well at the NFL level. But we have somewhat of a decent sample through that curve, that really important curve, 19, 20, 21. And so you look at that average and you compare them to that. I prefer, like I said, for the first look, I'm just going to look at what they did at their entire career. And if their numbers seem low, but they're of interest, like other people are ranking them high, Zach Reed from the Dynasty Dummies podcast and now the Fantasy Care show says on tape, this guy's actually good, then I'll take another look and say, well, my numbers are based on him only playing 20 games. So they clearly missed time compared to a normal average college season, which is like 30 to career, which is like 30 to 40 games. So let me break into his individual years and see what he did specifically. There are so many players every year. I'd like to say I do that for everyone, but that's really honestly my process. If you wanted to be more process orientated than me, you would do it for each one, not just look at their career total, but then look at their per game total for every year, their age adjusted for every year, and for every single example. But especially with wide receivers, we seem to get like a million maybe declaring every year. And so I really like to use the other types of information that I'm not good at, like tape grinding or the ranks on DLF or whatever site you prefer, to kind of find players that aren't performing well and don't look good according to what I like to look at, and then go and see if I can find an explanation. One example very recently was Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, not to mention JSN, all occupying the same space at the same time, like some kind of, if they were time travelers, they would have all died by morphing into one, time clock tells me. And that was very clear. Well, this situation was overly congested. So when you break it down and there was only two of them or only one of them available, they were actually hitting what you would expect by their age or by their team totals. But when they were all together, it kind of dragged their numbers down. You're like, okay, the tape guys or whatever other source of information you like to use are probably right here. There's more to their numbers than their career average is telling me. And you can see that pretty clearly. And I like to use, like I said, ranks or some other source that you trust. For me, Zach Reed or J. Mike Check, to find those players that the situations explain their bad results rather than the players explaining their bad results, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Sorry,
a lot of sense there. That's perfect.
Too much.
No, that's great. That's great. So the next question I have is kind of, I guess, why does this matter? Why does this metric matter? I'm going to hit it from a couple of perspectives. So would you characterize reception yards per team pass attempt as descriptive or predictive? And then why would you prioritize this metric over other things like, just receiving yards per game or yards per reception, or, why do you think this metric does a better job than some of the other stuff?
For a start, I'd say it's primarily wide receivers I'm talking about. I don't think it works as well for tight ends. I've played around with yards per attempt, like overall attempts for running backs, and it actually seems to have a lot of utility. I tried rushing yards per rushing attempt, and it didn't seem to have the same favor. I think volume at running back, it just works a little differently for reasons we're not going to get into. But probably pretty self-evident if you think about it. The things I want to say, one, so that I don't completely ruin your first attempt at hosting this show, one, because it's better than yards per route run. And I want to say it that way because yards per route run has entered the discourse as some kind of magical and important stat. It is predictive and descriptive. And I think it's best used as a descriptive stat. And that's why I think it's good. But if you test it one for one against every other stat that is available, or someone selling you the snake oil of this soul's who are good, and my model proves, as a statistic, receiving yards per team pass attempt, properly non-game adjusted, I'll put it that way, is going to hit higher 1-for-1 if you do a big sample or a big enough sample that it's actually valuable than any other single metric. And that definitely includes yards per route run. Is it actually better? Like I should use it instead of yards per route run? No, yards per route run's fine. It's actually a perfectly good statistic. It actually mirrors receiving yards per team pass attempt fairly well. And the numbers are even relatively similar, but they're slightly lower because of the nature of the statistic. I think, and one of the last things I tried to study was, what do you find when a player has higher or lower yards per route run versus receiving yards per team pass attempt? I actually think that's an interesting avenue I can't quite explain yet. I think that's something someone could dig into and really find some meat on the bone. But even though, yes, it tests slightly better if you do a realistic sample or not, frankly, what should I call it, a gerrymandered sample, it's going to test better, but not significantly that if you sort by it, you're going to find all the good players versus yards per route run. It's going to be, it's marginal, you know? But it is fun to say that it tests better than yards per route run, which is something you have to pay for. Whereas this is divide one number by another number that's fairly easy to find, and you have as good, technically better answer than the thing that you have to pay for. No statistic is actually going to predict much, especially if we're talking about rookies, anything really. But as a view with how much predictive power it has, and again, like I said, the reason I like it, it's trying to describe and does accurately a very simple thing that you can understand why that's important. How much of the team's receiving offense was this guy relative to how big the receiving offense was, the passing attempts total. And it does that perfectly. So I think the descriptive thing is there, and technically it has more predictive power. But again, me being me as a non-nerd that just as frustratedly banging my head, how are these nerds finding all the answers? Well, the truth is they're not just using a statistic or a model because they don't work. That's the actual truth. Receiving yards per team pass attempt is more predictive, but it doesn't solve the predictive problem of rookies. It just says it's a fairly viable stat for trying to evaluate a player. To be clear and yet somewhat succinct, that's as good as I can do. I think.
Love it. Last one for you. What are the limitations to this metric? So, like we talked about, sort of teammate. You bring up the Ohio State example, which
congested
is
situations are going to do it. Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry, they both look kind of ass with most statistics, unless you're looking at something like Dominator, which sucks for its own particular reason. And Olave and Wilson, when you find, and it's actually relatively rare, but when you find those good players on the same college team at the same time, well, we think it's rare because of the results, but maybe it happened more than we did, and they didn't get NFL opportunity because of it. That's the other interesting aspect to rookies that you can never really answer. But it seems to result in poorer averages. That doesn't necessarily mean they're poor averages. They're right on the cusp. But you would think someone that's done what Odell Beckham did the first 3 years of his career anyway, or even Jarvis Landry, who had multiple top 5 finishes for fantasy, they should test well in this, but they don't. Like Chris Olave and like Garrett Wilson, they're just okay. And it's pretty easy to explain that as a congested situation. The other limitations are we cannot, and I can't say this strongly enough, we cannot adjust for conference. Not just because the conferences have changed now and are probably going to change again. The idea behind it is solid, but how would you possibly difficulty level adjust something which is a per play evaluation when you're facing a different defender on every play and you're only facing them maybe a couple of times in a year and they're only playing maybe a max of 8 games, even if they play ball games, and statistics relies on volume. The reason you hear from me and probably a lot of people, if you listen to statistics stuff, is small sample. The NFL is a completely closed small sample system, and there's really no way of fixing it. And to even age adjusting, like I said, we have a relatively okay sample, especially through the ages of 19 and 20. Ages 18 and 21 are a little dubious with just the number of players who have gone on to do well in like a 25, 30 year period. Would have to wait, another 200 years to get an actually statistical viable sample. So the idea we're going to do that for conferences, which one have changed, and two, you'd have to play, you'd have to play by play the data and see them face the same defenders and the same play call and the same down and distance 20, 30, 40 times to really know how to. It's just not viable. It's what we need, what we would like to be able to do, but any conference adjusting is just not going to work. And same with any level of what if we adjust for the difficulty? You'll notice on that 16-player list I mentioned, players over 3, Demaryius Thomas peaks because he's a phenomenal player playing in this dirt league that throws the ball almost constantly. But so is Corey Davis, who is something of a flop, and I loved as a prospect because, I'm an idiot. But he was playing at a lower conference level too. There does seem to be, you're going to get better numbers at lower conferences, but the equation is not linear like that. Worse conference, better numbers. And it's also not even. For example, some of the hardest conferences or the best competition where the most NFL successes come from, have the highest averages in receiving yards per pass attempt or yards per route run. It's not a linear line, and it's also not a predictive line. It's not a line at all. It's kind of a scatter graph. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, I could go on for computation level for a while, but it's as far as too long didn't read what you need to know to get into it, there's no real way of adjusting any statistic, but yards per route, receiving yards per team pass attempt is not going to be easy to. That's why you have to dig into the player. It's just not going to do that for you. It's not. It's going to show Corey Davis is as good as Demaryius Thomas, which is, for our purposes, clearly not true.
Yeah, the one other one theoretically that, you're trying to account for all the variables. The one variable that is on the denominator here is the pass attempts. So if you have inefficient QB play, I
didn't even get that. Yeah, good point.
So right. So the point is, if you have a QB that has a completion percentage that's well below another QB that has a very high completion percentage, with the pass attempts being the team pass attempts, not just how many routes that wide receiver is running, that does bring a little bit of QB efficiency into it, as well as we talked about teammate conference exceptions, all those things. Maybe you might even add in something like a low volume offense into there, although this does a good job of capturing market share. You can maybe get a false positive if you have a very, very low volume offense and a sort of like a very high reception yards per team pass attempt, because it's maybe artificial in this low volume offense.
One more try at a quick succinct why it matters, which is going to fail as well, but I'll try. If you sort by career receiving yards per team pass attempt for wide receivers since 2001, only look at players that have 2 receiving yards per team pass attempt for their entire college career. Look at the players that were actually drafted in the first 3 rounds. You are going to catch like 90% of all the fantasy hits. Now, is that going to order them for you very well? No. I mean, again, nothing ranks very well. That's where you're going to have more information and dig into the player a little bit more. I encourage it. But for free, you can get a list of 95% of all fantasy relevant NFL draft hits just by looking at players that drafted or had a reasonable expectation to be drafted and played and had 2 receiving yards per team pass attempt. That's pretty good for one number just off the top of your head. You're also going to get some misses in there, but no more than most active NFL rankers are going to have in their history. It's also going to miss players, but the players that were somewhat controversial, if you know what I mean. It's like Puka Nacua most recently had terrible statistics. It's not like receiving yards per team pass attempt missed him. He just had terrible production statistics. He was not productive at the college level relative to most players that hit. So it was actually telling you the truth. It just didn't tell you the answer. They was actually going to be phenomenally productive. Many tape guys are screaming, well, I could have told. Well, that's why I listened to you too, bro. And a lot of tape guys were saying that's why I missed on him. Like most of the tape guys that I trust and have a good history on this also didn't like a lot of his tape. And so I didn't unflag him, as it were. So most of the players that aren't going to enter that list with 2 receiving yards per team pass attempt for their entire college career are either going to be didn't play enough. AJ Brown's a good one. He had a lot of injury history through the time that he was in college. I don't think his numbers quite come up to par, if I remember right. Although if you go season by season, that one season he was healthy, he looks really good. Again, that's why you should look at more than one number. Or the ones that just don't have good statistics. Some players are going to be good and did not produce quote unquote well in college. That's just true. And again, just for one number, that's not going to rank. It's not going to solve, not going to make sure you never have a miss again. I think that's a fairly good initial filter. That's why I like it.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so final thoughts. If too long didn't read, if you wanted to have the people come away with one thing they should take away from this, what would you say from reception yards per team pass attempt?
It's a good initial look, and you should really dig around with it. There's a lot more to find out about it. No one's uncovered the bottom of the statistics well as it is. But if you understand the limits of what statistics can and can't do, then it's a very useful first look, and it can do a lot for you with relatively little effort and get you started in asking what are ultimately much more important questions. It's a very easy filter just to get you to the most important prospects. Like, I haven't even made ranks this year, but I already have the list of wide receivers that I know is going to be, again, 90 to 95% complete, having done no other work and not watched a single down of football, just because I know the thresholds that you're meant to hit for your career average. I'm going to have to dig in to make sure I didn't miss any, but I already know the players who are mostly going to be useful. And when I went and checked them against a ranking of DLF, I was like, oh, I captured every player that everyone thinks is important to rank in the top 15. I don't watch a down of football. Like, that's interesting to me. It's also, a lot less work than watching all those downs of football. Word up to the film grinders, you actually work harder. I'm just going to say it. It's more work. But I get there and since I'm just a fantasy player, not someone invested in being a better coach or understanding the game better, I just want to score more fantasy points, guy. Sorry, but that's my goal. That's attractive. That's like 90% of the work, 20% of the effort, and you move on from there. Go listen to the people actually doing a lot of hard work grinding film, or someone that understands statistics a hell of a lot more than me, like Jay. And from there, I really think the edge in fantasy, not talking in the NFL, never am, is playing the game, which is why I really enjoyed the podcast we did together. And I think we've continued to collaborate a little bit onwards, because a lot of the way you think about the game and questions you think to ask are about how to play the game. That's why TJ Hernandez at 4 for 4, if he's still there, was one of the early risers and one of the really game-changing analysts. It's because he used to be a poker player. You play the game, you play the player opposite you, you play the market value if you're listening to Jay Stein. And if you add that on top of a very simple personal evaluation of whether you think a player was productive or not in college, with receivers using receiving yards per team pass attempt, 20% of the work, 95% of the results, and you can even build on it from there. I mean, I don't think a statistic can do better for you than that.
Love it. Thank you. And thanks so much, Peter, for joining. We really appreciate it. Again, you can find all Peter's work at PA Howdy on X, on Bluesky, senior DLF writer, Patreon. Go join his Patreon. I'm part of his Patreon. Between, of course, the two of us together, we did not make 20 minutes for the first show, but we'll try and do that. But if you did find this helpful, please like, comment, subscribe down below, and see you next time on The Most Important Thing.